Hello, welcome back to Movie Husbands. Today we are reviewing Love Lies Bleeding. Directed by Rose Glass, Love Lies Bleeding follows Lou, a reclusive gym manager with a crime family who falls in love with an ambitious bodybuilder named Jackie. The film stars Kristen Stewart, Katy O'Brian, Jena Malone, Dave Franco, and Ed Harris. So Jeffrey, what do you think about Love Lies Bleeding?
So this film is co-written and directed by Rose Glass. Rose's one other feature is a horror film called Saint Maud that I think unfortunately got kind of lost in the shuffle with a lot of the quarantine era films that was released. All of the hype from the festivals had been talking about this movie. By the time it actually premiered, it felt like, all of the hype was behind it. Anyway, in my opinion, that film wasn't exactly a masterwork, but it certainly showed the work of a bold new filmmaker. That film's rigorous attention to detail, I think, made it stand out, and it had a real knack for just great tension that this film also has. Love Lies Bleeding, I think, mimics a lot of what was good about Saint Maud, but it really refastens a lot of her talents into this neo-noir style that I really enjoyed. Everything I just described, whether it's this more lived-in attention to detail or this more oppressive atmosphere that almost resembles a horror film, ambiguity of character and morality, that carries through the film, and I think it's definitely quite a bit of a level up from Saint Maud, in my opinion, and just had this tremendous confidence of vision that, frankly, I'm just not used to from such a young filmmaker. The film is fostering this 80s aesthetic that's neon-soaked, sweat-drenched, grimy, bloody. I'm not going to say it's an original style, but it has a very unique vision and style that I think she replicated almost flawlessly.
Yeah, it really has a vibe about it, and everything that's a part of the filmmaking process really lends itself to this vibe. You mentioned it has this 80s theme, and this really follows to the score and the set design and the costumes. And then you have these Western rugged elements that are built into the film just due to the film's location, and that really lends itself well to the grittiness of the violence in the film. So many of these things just play so well off one another that you can't help but feeling like this movie is just a vibe. And as you said, it's just a confidence of vision. It's a very singular thing. Everything fits together really well. I want to go back a little bit to Kristen Stewart's character. She plays the main role of Lou in the film. She works at this gym and she comes in contact with this other woman, Jackie. They draw this connection based on just this physical attraction to one another. And then the movie slowly falls apart from there when we found out that they are connected in certain ways because Jackie ends up working at the gun range that Kristen Stewart's character, Lou, her father, is the one that owns it.
The film takes a little while to get to its inciting incident. There's an inciting incident that when you see it, you're going to know what I'm talking about. But the film takes a little bit of time to make these connections, almost because it's doing all of this fun, interesting setup for a rather exhilarating third act that's pretty breathless. I like how it took its time where the audience knew some of these connections, but they hadn't come to fruition for the characters in the film quite yet.
Yeah, and as you mentioned in your opening impressions, the film does a really wonderful job building tension. And a lot of that tension and suspense is built with these horror-like qualities that the film utilizes, like these techniques that are built into the film. A lot of those will have to do with these very short cuts that have musical cues, whether it's the score or whether it's just a one-note thing, but they happen at the exact same time, like a shot changes. So it lends itself to this mysteriousness, this what can happen just on the flip of a dime, because the shot will just change really quickly without expectation.
Yeah, there's a repeated motif of Ed Harris kind of bathed in this red light and him holding a gun, and we gradually see more of that scene throughout the film, but they cut to that a lot in almost this jump scare fashion.
Yeah, and it's not a jump scare. I wouldn't say the film's
not scary.
It's not a horror in any means, but it uses the techniques of horror films to bring about this tension. There was a lot of mysterious qualities about it with the characters because you're not really sure their backstories. We could talk about Jackie for a moment in that regard because we don't really know much about her at all. She shows up in this town. She is currently homeless because she's looking at this bodybuilding competition in Vegas. So this is seemingly a stop on her way there. Even as her relationship with Kristen Stewart's character progresses, the only snippet we get is a phone call that she has where she's seemingly talking with her younger sister. Yeah. And then her mom comes on the phone and lambasts her about not calling ever again and not coming back home. Maybe her family doesn't like that she is bisexual, if they knew that, or it's hard to tell.
It could be a variety of things.
It could be a variety of things, but it seems like the mom thinks she's a bad person. Whatever reason that is, that still doesn't give us really much information as to her backstory.
It's certainly true in the scant character details that we get, but the film lives in in this great tradition of film noir filmmaking. So this is review probably for a lot of classic film fans, but film noirs are known for having a colder atmosphere, morally ambiguous characters, and not a clear sense of right and wrong, very morally ambiguous, and also like a rather cynical, dim view of humanity in general. And usually some sort of suspenseful crime element that gradually gets introduced into the story. Film noir was recontextualized a lot in the 70s with films like The Long Goodbye, which undid stereotypes from the 40s and 50s, recontextualized them for the 70s era. And even in the modern era, we have a lot of great examples of noir like Drive, Memento, Widows, the film that Steve McQueen made a couple of years ago. They all have these characteristics of film noir that update them to the modern era. And it's almost like each generation or each iteration of it has these new generational contexts that are really interesting. So even though Love Lies Bleeding takes place in the Reagan era, and that's in the 80s, we have updated gender and sexual politics that wouldn't be common in, say, well, certainly not in like a 40s or 50s film noir. We have these surreal flourishes that counteract what's typically a very realistic genre. Additionally, we have, like, as we were talking about, these more modern filmmaking techniques like fast cutting, slow motion. We have some really cool sound design here that's very drony and has this really oppressive atmosphere. I've always loved tracking this genre and what each decade kind of does to this genre, because the tropes, the skeleton of it, are so good that they've lasted for 70 years, and we just see them recontextualized in all these interesting ways. And I think this film lives in that great tradition.
Okay, so I have so many things I want to tap into what you just said, because one of them is the score. That really lends itself well to the foreboding quality of the film, this tension that's being built. Right at the beginning of this movie, you have a sense, you have this drony intro looking down this pit of rock. And that obviously makes sense later in the film, but for us, it really opens the film with this impression of, okay, we are not going somewhere good.
Yeah.
We're not going somewhere happy.
Yeah.
This is not an 80s fun movie.
There's a lot of 70s and 80s like paranoia crime thrillers.
Yeah.
And this film is definitely a little different than those films, but I think it has a similar sense of foreboding.
Then on top of that, the characters, I wouldn't say that they're very much well developed, but that's also very intentional, is that we're not supposed to know so much about them. They're supposed to be a little bit surface level.
Yeah, to some degree, the characters, I think, are almost more in service of archetype and plot than they are empathy or emotional connection.
Which in some films wouldn't work at all, but in this film I thought worked perfectly. Kristen Stewart character in particular, I found her pretty interesting because she is part of this crime family where she obviously doesn't really want to have much to do with them anymore, but she's still present. Even though she doesn't really live her life the same way that her father and her brother do, she still takes some things from her childhood in terms of that, like her understanding of violence and how it operates and how to maybe clean up something and get rid of some evidence. And Jackie, on the other hand, she is not familiar with violence at all. So she seems a little bit more of a pure soul when she comes into this. She is slowly ruined by that. But some of that is also partly Kristen Stewart's character's fault because she gives her these drugs. I think they're steroids, but they seem like steroids on crack or something like that because they do some crazy to her. That actually goes into the other sound design elements that you were talking about earlier that I also wanted to get to. Yes, it's very like a queasy feeling sound design elements that reminded me a lot of Teton. A lot of aspects of this movie reminded me of Teton. The violence, the way that...
Sudden Needles?
Yeah, the sudden needles. Oh gosh.
Makes me want to watch Teton.
Yeah.
I love Teton.
And the sound design, you have these really interesting noises when muscles flex and veins bulge, and it just
fluid, flexy. I don't even know how to describe it, but it was giving me the ick.
Yes, definitely had the ick.
Going back to Kristen Stewart for a second, I just want to say I love her as an actress. I can't tell you the last time that she had a performance that I didn't care for. I can't even think of one. She harnesses this natural anxiety she has either as a person or just as an acting presence. You can almost feel her eyes twitching whenever she's in a performance, and she harnesses it with this uneasy, anxious exterior, but this interior that's just ready to explode. There's always so much more to her than appears, and she brings this quality that's so mysterious and as a viewer makes you want to dig into it more and see what she's all about.
Going back to the archetypes that we were talking about earlier, you had mentioned the Ed Harris one where they have the close-ups. But Ed Harris wasn't the only person that they did this for. They did it for Jackie as well. And hers, she had this very innocent quality about her close-ups. And I thought that was just very interesting.
Yeah.
And in a way, for Jackie's character, played by Katy O'Brian, I thought she did a wonderful job balancing these two diametrically opposed emotional states. One is just very innocent, and this other side of her where she has a tendency to lean into violence, and very much like a commentary on humanity. We are capable of such good things and such bad things. And I think she encompassed all that very well in her role.
Yeah, and in some ways, that archetype requires us to buy into it because there are some logical leaps maybe in the plot later in the film that you really have to buy some of the actions that she does because that necessitates the plot moving forward. And I, for the most part, bought it. You can maybe pick it apart and say it doesn't totally work, but the film is so effortless in its execution of tone and atmosphere that I was just along for the ride no matter what kind of crazy things happened. And there's a rather crazy, surreal thing that happens in like the last 2 minutes that's like Godzilla type stuff that even worked for me, even though I thought it was incredibly strange. But I just think it fit into the film's overall aura, strangely.
Yes, it completely worked for me. That happened actually one other time during the film. Actually, why don't we just talk about it? I don't know why we just don't talk about it.
Yeah, spoilers.
Yeah, spoilers. Anyways, we're going to get a little bit more into the details of the film. Go see the movie Love Lies Bleeding before, and then come back to this moment. There is this moment where she goes to the brother-in-law's house.
Yep.
There's a lot of domestic violence happening in this household, and Kristen Stewart's character wishes for this guy to not be around anymore. And so Jackie gives the request, goes to the house, and brutally takes out this man, played by Dave Franco. And I think this was one of the first times we saw the violent nature of this film, but also it was the first time where we saw this interesting aspect of her growing larger, where she was bigger than a normal person. Her head was like almost to the ceiling.
I also love the way that violence is conveyed because it's a pretty violent scene, but you don't see very much and you hear a lot.
Yes.
You don't realize how awful and how violent what happened was until you see the after effects.
Yes.
And you see the after effects like a couple of different times. It's nauseating each time, and that doesn't happen to be very easily, so I almost appreciated it in a sense.
And they played that the same way they did it in Teton with the chair when she goes to the house and she takes out that guy with the chair.
Yeah, that's the scene I keep thinking about when I want to rewatch Teton.
Personally, I just thought this as a metaphor for when you have a lot of adrenaline and you're very upset, you become stronger than you actually are. So she appears bigger, even though she really isn't in reality.
Yeah,
but
exactly.
It's just the superhuman things that people can do when they're put under a lot of stress and pressure.
Exactly. I think it was like an impressionistic touch. But I thought that those were some really interesting, fun little flourishes. Going back to the violence for a second, I like in general how the violence in this film is very off-kilter and unexpected. There's not really an action sequence to be had in this film at all, but there is sudden, brutally unanticipated violence that happens throughout it. And frankly, I prefer it that way just because it deglamorizes violence a little bit.
Yeah, I completely agree. And on a side note, I do want to mention some of the shot compositions in this film because there's some really cool stuff happening, especially some droney stuff.
No, she's a real filmmaker.
Yeah.
She's really puts a lot of interesting, I think, thoughts into her shot composition.
I don't know why, but this aerial shot that was looking completely down at the cop cars as they were going into the canyon, I thought that was really cool. I don't know. There's some really cool stuff that was just a little bit unique and flourished that you wouldn't see in other films. I do want to talk about the ending. I thought it was a little bit of a nod to Kill Bill Volume 1. It's like them riding off in their pickup truck, which is kind of like the wagon.
Oh, yeah. Which is in itself like a reference to countless times that's happened throughout film history. But anyway.
Sorry. So I'm taking that from another reference of another movie.
Yeah, I mean, Tarantino loves his references.
Yeah, that's true.
I totally hear what you're saying. And we didn't talk about this, but the film has a kind of odd sense of humor. It's never overtly funny, but it does seem to have some knowledge of the ridiculousness of its premise and some of its scenes.
Yes.
It's almost walking this line where you feel all this tension and all this anxiety, but you also realize the innate ridiculousness of it at the same time. Really cool tonal thing that it's not in every scene, but it's there a little bit. There's primarily a scene where there's a body behind a couch and she's talking to some FBI agents and there's a lot of tension going on.
And
But the cat is doing some stuff that's kind of funny. And it really works for me, just this odd mashup of tension, violence, and humor.
Yeah, and some of it was to the point of laughter and some of it was to the point of cringiness from me. The girl character that's like obsessed with Lou.
Yeah, you have to have kind of a dark sense of humor, but if you don't find a little bit of humor in Daisy's fate, she was on that track from the second I met her, but that was a little funny to me. Definitely not played for tragedy, I don't think.
No, I don't think it's played for tragedy. I think it's just okay. We have to clean this last piece up because we can't move on without it. And she's there. So,
so you ready to go to grades?
I'm ready to go grades. I give this film a B+. I really enjoyed it. I think one thing we didn't talk about is the overall message of the film. It's not a big thing. I know the movie is more
Love
of a vibe.
conquers all.
Love conquers all. But I think it's about living your own life. This whole movie, Kristen Stewart is still stuck in this town. You almost have this feeling of like, why does she still stay there? What is keeping her there? And there's one moment that Jackie actually asked her that, and her answer isn't really anything that great, I think.
Yeah.
The only reason she seemed to be staying was because of her sister, who was the victim of domestic violence. I remember that she turns to her and she says, "You don't know what love is." I think that just put a nail in the coffin for her and the reason that she actually wants to stay there.
The theme you extrapolated, I think, is totally true. I will say it's a film that doesn't seem to have a lot of thematic heft to me. Anyway, I give the film a B. I think it's lovely. It sounds odd to say, but it's a lot of fun. If
It is a lot of fun,
if you're the type of person that enjoys a suspenseful, anxious time at the movies and you don't know who's going to live and who's going to die, I think this film has a ton of stylized, interesting sequences that are really fun to pick apart. We were actually in an oddly crowded theater. A lot of people came out to see this movie last night. They seemed to be having a good time, feeling kind of queasy and kind of anxious, and I did too.
All right, and that's it for our review of Love Lies Bleeding. Love Lies Bleeding is now in theaters, so if you haven't seen it, go check it out. Let us know in the comments, what did you think about this film? As always, thank you guys for watching, and we'll see you next time.